Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Joining us for the second half of our show is Surse Pierpoint, currently on leave as General Manager of Colón Import Export. Surse recently stepped up to manage Panama's Colón Free Trade Zone, a program he and others have been lobbying to launch for a long time. Surse, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more about what gets me out of bed bright and early in the morning to start working to make the other side of the isthmus over there in Colón a really interesting place to be going forward in these next couple of years.
Well, thanks so much, and I'm glad we tracked you down by cell phone in Panama. This is a nice, clean connection. I asked you on the show to discuss the effort you've been leading to create a new free trade zone in Panama, but before we get into that, I'd like to dig into your background a little bit. You're the great-grandson of a Texas doctor who went down to Panama to help with malaria control way back when they were building the Panama Canal, and your family's been there ever since. You got your own start as an entrepreneur working in your father's warehouse business. Tell us about that.
Well, I was going to school in North Carolina, and at the end of the university career, my dad said, well, what are you going to do after college? And I said, after college, what do you mean? I didn't know there was life after college. But he said, yeah, there's an opportunity down here. If you're up for it, I think I can convince the board that you could come on board, but you're going to have to do a little bit more professional education, because at North Carolina, I was studying Spanish and Latin American studies, and that was really something that was not very much business related. So I got my MBA out at Thunderbird in Arizona, and then came to work in 1984 and started in the warehouse. And I can truly say that I started working before faxes and containers, because that was my first job, was being in the warehouse, going to get the goods off of the ship into the freight house, from the freight house to the warehouse. So this was really before containers became instituted. So, it was really learning it from the bottom up. Warehouse operation in a company that was a pioneer in the Colón Free Trade Zone and was starting to grow into logistics. And today it's a very large group of companies in the Colón Free Trade Zone that are doing logistics. What we're doing out of the free trade zone is moving other people's cargo. That means they don't have to invest a lot of capital. And that means then that as a result of that, they don't need to invest in warehousing and people, because that's what we offer, our 3PL services.
So transshipping and working with folks bringing stuff in from Asia who want to maybe distribute it to the East Coast, and warehousing for them. Are you allowed to tell us a little bit about some of your key clients?
We really concentrate on sectors like pharmaceuticals. The group of companies handles some of the major pharma companies that, from even in as early as the 60s, already saw the opportunities of having a regional distribution center out of Panama for distribution into these areas, these small economies that by themselves would be very difficult to be able to justify such small volumes coming out of a factory. So we're kind of a midpoint between the factory and the final destination. And we do electronics as well, companies that you might recognize like Panasonic, Sony, pharmaceutical companies like Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer. Footwear is one of our newest clients. We're handling logistics for Payless Shoe Source, who do their Latin American operations out of the Colón Free Trade Zone. So that's another exciting story. It's all these multinationals that all have the same problem. How can I lower my inventory and get it into the market as quickly as possible? So that's what we've been doing for basically since the Free Zone started way back in 1948.
So, Surse, you worked your way up to general manager. You spent several decades there. You're on leave now, as I mentioned before. What attracted you into public policy? I understand you were a card-carrying communist in college.
Well, that was an interesting transition because, in university, before you start paying your own bills, it's very easy to get swept away with the emotional aspects of trying to save the world. And at North Carolina, the Communist Workers' Party in Greensboro, North Carolina, was still pretty active. And I got to know a couple of those people and, of course, fell under the spell. You know the old saying, if you're not a communist before 30, you don't have a heart. If you're a communist after 30, you don't have a brain. So I was in the heart mode of getting involved in trying to save the world. But when you start paying your own bills in the free trade zone back in 88, and in the context of 1988 in Panama, this is the last years of the Noriega regime. So this was a couple of years before the invasion, and things were kind of sketchy. And so I got involved with the Free Zone Users Association, which was a group of people that got together to try and lobby the government to not have the heavy hand of government in a dictatorship. This wasn't even a democracy. It was a dictatorship. So it was kind of a really big contrast to being in college. But that's where I got started in public policy, because I realized that if you want to do things, you have to get involved. It's very easy to complain without getting into the trenches. And so that was the beginning in the Free Zone Users Association. I've been in the Free Zone for 32 years. That's all I've done, basically. I'm an anachronism as far as being in one job for basically my whole professional career. But that was the beginning of it.
So, Surse, paint us a picture of the Panama economy. It's something that looks pretty opaque from the U.S.
Well, I think part of the success, and we're the fastest growing economy in Latin America, 6% GDP growth year on year for pretty much the last 10 years. So we're a roaring economy, very diversified. I think that's also part of the contrast, say, with something like the Venezuelan economy, that 90% of its economy depends on oil. We're a very diversified economy, but the interesting aspect is that the aggregates that you could put under the column logistics make up almost 30% of the business. We're taking advantage of our geography. Obviously, everybody knows about the canal, but there's so many things associated around the canal, like, for instance, the Colón Free Trade Zone, which was basically created to take advantage of that geographic position, to be able to get stuff off of the boats and do something with it and generate some jobs. The Free Trade Zone these days employs 30,000 people, whereas the canal is only 10,000 people.
The Colón Free Trade Zone has been an integral part of Panama for almost 70 years. Critics have called it an island of richness in a sea of poverty. What's that all about?
Well, unfortunately, the second city of Colón, where the Free Trade Zone is located, enjoys the benefits or lack of benefits that the Free Zone has. The Free Zone has Free Trade Zone benefits that are the exemption of duties. So that makes the ability to park inventory in Panama without having to pay duties and taxes. That's what makes it attractive. But the city has suffered from the heavy hand of rent controls and the fact that you can't evict somebody. And so you've got a downward spiral where the owner of the building can't collect rent, and so he's not going to invest, and then people stay, and then the building falls in around their ears. So it's a really remarkable contrast of poverty and richness separated by a wall. So that was part of the struggles that really got me involved, is because that's where my great-grandfather arrived, is in Colón way back in 1906. So there's a strong emotional attachment to that city. And to see it today versus what you hear about from my family members that I was a kid, that it was really a pretty marvelous place to be back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, because it was pretty much of a boom town. So to see it now, it's kind of hard to believe that that was possible. And that's what we're trying to recapture with these public policy efforts that I'm now involved in the public sector.
Now, when you say separated by a wall, you literally mean separated by a wall.
Exactly. Because the goods on the Free Zone side of the wall have not paid duties and taxes to be in the Republic of Panama. So there's a customs control that doesn't allow the free movement from one side to the other. You have to have a control. So the wall, for those friends of ours on the left, is keeping the poor people out, but actually what it's doing is maintaining the legality of the situation of that inventory that is in transit from someplace going to someplace else.
But it's also keeping the economic activity and riches from leaking out into the rest of Panama.
Well, that's part of the reason why, if the example of the Free Zone looks like it's such a success, why can't we expand those benefits into the city? And that was kind of what motivated me to get involved with the now president of the Colón Chamber of Commerce, to see if we couldn't hook up and tear down that wall of distance that existed between us as two different entities, Free Zone versus the city, to get together and kind of rescue a law that was a dead letter law from way back in 1992 that had never been implemented, but that we thought was an opportunity to start stimulating a renaissance in the city.
So tell us about the Colón Puerto Libre project.
Colón Puerto Libre was a law that was signed by the first Democratic president after the dictatorship in 1989, and he signed it in 1992, but it never enjoyed the favor of the Panama City business community because they felt that it was unfair advantages to the second city, Colón. And so it would kind of just languish. But it was only until we got together as Colón Chamber of Commerce and the Free Zone Users Association to lobby the candidates for the current period, 2014-2019. It's a 5-year presidency. Mm-hmm. We lobbied the three candidates. We said, will you support the implementation, the final implementation of this law that's languished for so long? And all three of them said yes. And fortunately, the candidate who won the elections has also some strong ties to the city, and he's pretty much made the Colón Renaissance part of his legacy for his 5 years. So we were very fortunate that we found a sympathetic ear in these efforts that have culminated with the signing into law of an improved version of that 1992 law, which is effective as of last week when the president signed it and should be implemented within the next 4 months.
So what are the scope and goals of the project?
It's got two aspects to it. And what we're doing is a copy-paste of the old city of Panama City, which was also an area that was economically depressed, but through the implementation of some incentives for developers to be able to go in and grab these magnificent old buildings, refurbish them, and have exemption on property taxes, import duties, and profits on the sale of those refurbished buildings, has become one of the top destinations in Latin America. The old town of Panama, if you look at it, contrasted to where it was when I came to Panama, because I lived there for 3 years, 85 to 88. I have a fatal attraction to urban renewal projects. And so we lived there for 3 years, and that's what we're trying to do, is copy it. And that's the one aspect of it, is the urban renewal, but also the commercial aspect. What we're trying to promote is that this can be a point of sale for inventories, kind of a big outlet mall style place. I think of places like Sawgrass outside of Miami, which is a huge destination for Latin American tourists who want to go buy last season's models at significant discounts.
Encouraging tourists to come and shop.
Yes.
There are so many parallels between Panama and Dubai. If you look at how Dubai got its start, I mean, now it's the Hong Kong of the Middle East. We actually did a program on this a while back. You look at how Dubai got its start, and it was a free trade port focusing on logistics. Are there lessons in Dubai's trajectory for Panama?
You know, I think it's interesting because what we see in Dubai is very similar to what we saw in the Colón Free Trade Zone. At the very beginning, it became a place, depending on the Colombian economy, a very closed economy that was trying to implement those old, if it's not made here, we don't want it type of policies that were promoted way back in the 60s. So that what we've seen is that the success of Dubai and the success of the Free Zone are basically related to openness. As you open it, it's going to boom, because that was the genesis of Dubai. And so I think that's a really apt model. If you look at the middle of the desert, you put in some decent incentives and it will flourish. And anybody who's been to Dubai, I've been there about 5 years ago, and hopefully I'll be there later this year again. It's a remarkable story.
Well, the main incentives there are no taxes and rule of law. They actually imported British law.
Exactly.
Of course, one of the other things that made Dubai work is a benevolent dictator. Can a project like Colón Puerto Libre work in a populist democracy?
There's certainly, and that's been part of the challenges. There's certainly a lot of detractors, and in a democracy, you have a lot of people opining about what should be done, and so you've got to listen to everybody. So sometimes forward movement is a little bit slower because it doesn't seem like everybody's rowing in the right direction. Not that I'm a fan of dictatorships, but I would say that somebody like Lee Kuan Yew, for instance, and the Singapore story, which is another incredible story of rule of law and incentives, that would certainly happen much faster, say, than in a raucous democracy somewhere else in the world.
There's a major physical expansion going on in the Panama Canal right now. What impact is that likely to have on the economy?
The example that I use for people to understand what's happening with the canal expansion is that movie Cars about Route 66 versus the interstate highway system. 10 years ago, the Panamanian government proposed a referendum, should we expand the Panama Canal? And what we saw was that container vessels going forward were going to get bigger and bigger, and we had the size restrictions of the current canal, so that if we didn't expand it, those boats just simply wouldn't come here.
Right.
So 10 years ago, that was approved, and June 26th, we'll have the inauguration. And interestingly, 10 years ago, it wasn't even on the drawing board, but the first vessel that won the lottery to transit the expanded canal is going to be an LNG vessel leaving the Gulf going to Asia, which is a counterflow to the typical trade flow. So that's something that wasn't even in the original design, but you've got these arbitrage opportunities of a really cheap fracking in America, export that gas to where it's needed in Asia, so that those counterflows are going to be very interesting, new source of revenue for the expanded canal.
Now, there's been a lot of turmoil in that part of the world. We're watching Venezuela collapse around the ears of its socialist leadership. What impact has that had on the Panama economy?
That has really hit us in the Colón Free Trade Zone. It used to be our number one destination, and now it's number 4. It's just collapsed. And it's really sad to see, because it's a tremendous economy. It's an oil economy. It's really hard to destroy an oil economy, but the socialists have done it. And so what we're seeing is that we're kind of hanging on. And that's why I think Colón Puerto Libre is kind of an interesting diversion as we wait for a resolution to that situation in Venezuela, because we really depend. It's a very large economy, and it's hard to replace that type and size of an economy somewhere else in the region, because our area of operation is basically the Caribbean, all those little islands in the Caribbean, Central America, and then Venezuela and Colombia, which are our major partners. So until Venezuela turns around, we're going to be struggling to see what we can do to make up for that lost revenue.
So what you're saying is that the Venezuelan consumers have no money, they're not buying anything, and so you're not shipping anything there.
Exactly. The currency controls, you're seeing crazy inflation, 2, 3. I even saw something yesterday that it's expected the next year inflation will be north of 1,000%. You know, it's the Weimar Republic. They can't even pay the UK company that prints their bolívares. So it's really a tragic situation where you see mismanagement translate into hardships for the population.
People have high hopes for Cuba once both the Castros die. How could the long-suffering Cuban people benefit from trade with Panama?
That's one challenge that a lot of people say the Colón Free Trade Zone is going to be toast once Cuba opens up, because its natural area of influence is the United States. But I think that we still have some opportunities, because I don't know how quickly that's going to be dismantled. And even if the Castros die, will the Senate or the Congress decide to dismantle the embargo? That's the big question out there. The other question out there is, once we have the expanded canal, it's not a given that the boats are going to stop here. These larger vessels are going to make fewer stops. So Cartagena in Colombia is a challenge. Mariel in Cuba could be a challenge. So again, the story's not written yet going forward as to what's going to happen with the Cuban economy. But obviously with opening up, it should give us an opportunity, because we're a major source of Asian produced goods. So that should allow us to compete with American producers. And a lot of the American producers are producing in China as well. And we've got a lot of multinationals that have set up in the Colón Free Trade Zone, and Cuba would be a natural addition to their scope of countries that they serve from the free zone.
Well, competition is great as long as they don't tie your hands.
Exactly.
So, Surse, if things go well and there are no major setbacks, paint us a picture of the future of the Colón Puerto Libre project.
What I think we would hope to see going forward is if we can do a copy-paste of what's happening in the old city of Panama City, and we can get that urban renewal going, and we've got those incentives that have obviously been successful in the Colón Free Trade Zone, we should see a new jewel in the Caribbean. And I know that sounds cliche, but I know that it's possible because it used to be the jewel of the Caribbean. And so what I'm hoping is that the legacy going forward of all of these efforts of so many people is that we can, through the rule of law and incentives, make risk capital not so risky anymore in this second city of Panama. And it'll be that place that my grandmother used to talk about that was such a cool place to be, kind of like what Havana used to be in the 50s, from what I've heard from a lot of people here in Panama.
So, Surse, thanks for sharing your story with us. We'll be checking in from time to time. Good luck with the project.
Thank you so much, Bill. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this project, and I know it's something that needs to have some wider distribution, and your efforts are greatly appreciated.
That was Surse Pierpoint, manager of Panama's Colón Free Trade Zone, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. And if you'd like to support more thoughtful programming like this, please hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Old Boston Restorations, a Victorian property management company in Boston South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.